finally. It's Healing Racial Trauma, a novel, anti-racist and culturally informed CBT intervention. And so I just want to, I imagine probably most of you have heard of racial trauma. For those of you who haven't, it has been described as a psychological injury that can be caused by hate or fear of a person due to their race, ethnicity, or skin color. However, it's actually broader than that. It's not simply caused by a hateful person. It's caused by many, many layers, in our society, from individual to systemic forms of racism. And I'll go into that in a little more in a few minutes. But it is cumulative in nature, and that's just something we're discovering about trauma in general. Generally, it's not people who've had one trauma that get PTSD. It's people who've had multiple traumas. And the more traumas you have, the more likely you are to get PTSD. And the same is true for racial trauma. Now, some experiences of racial trauma would fit the DSM-5's definition of like a criterion A trauma, but some do not. We don't necessarily make a distinction because research shows actually that the whole criterion A thing is problematic anyway. And what's really important are the symptoms. And so, there may be people who have racial trauma, and maybe they have symptoms of racial trauma or full-blown symptoms of PTSD, but what they experienced might not be something that someone would classify as a criterion A trauma. Could be lots of small experiences over the lifetime that have just started to overwhelm their ability to cope. And so racial trauma happens at many levels. Again, there's an individual trauma that can be part of it when one person maybe is a racist and so, I'm gonna beat you up, or I'm going to harm you, or burn a cross on your lawn. Certainly those are traumatic things. But people are also suffering due to things like structural trauma, right? So those are things like thinking that you have a safety net, but then when you go make a complaint to HR, you get blamed for the racism that happened to you, right? So these things can be traumatic as well. Community trauma. So people who may live in under-resourced communities due to racism, then suffering the effects of under and over-policing, under-resourced neighborhoods and community violence. Cultural trauma. This happens when a whole cultural group has experienced a trauma together. For example, like the Holocaust that happened to Jewish people under Nazi Germany, right? So that would be a cultural trauma because it happened to a bunch of people in one cultural group at one time. And then historical trauma, which maybe goes even further back. It could be, for example, like the genocide of indigenous people who are still surviving today, but who are suffering because of all the losses that they experienced due to that historical trauma. So racial trauma is usually more than one of these, can be a combination of these things, sometimes can be all of these things. Now, I mentioned individual traumas can cause racial trauma. Here are some examples of individual traumas. And the reason I'm putting these up is because when we think about, again, these criterion A traumas, we're usually thinking about things like rape or combat or a natural disaster. But there's lots of things that are traumatizing that are happening to people of color all the time. And they tend not to be on our radar as actual criterion A traumas. And here are a few of those things. And I won't read through all of these for time, but these are all things that can be experienced as even life-threatening. Like, for example, you may think, oh, well, a racial slur, why is that life-threatening? Well, for me as a African-American, the N-word was often followed by violence. So that's, part of my cultural history, which can make that, even just that word, a weapon of terror. Now, in our own research, we found that a third of Black, Indigenous, and people of color that we surveyed, based on instruments that we had developed and validated, had clinically significant symptoms of racial trauma. So that meant that they were having some symptoms, perhaps similar to PTSD, that were interfering with their daily lives and had been for some time. And so this is a problem because there are no validated treatments for racial trauma. Not to mention, therapists are not actually well prepared to treat racial trauma. And so there was a research study that was done in 2018 with over 100 counselors, and they asked the counselors these questions. What factors do therapists identify that contribute to racial trauma? Do you address this in session? What training have you received? And for the most part, therapists had seen racial trauma. They had seen people who were traumatized from all of these things. But when it came to actually treating it, even though most of them had seen these clients, 2/3 had not received any training in how to identify it. And 4 out of 5 had not received any training in how to treat it. Now, that was a US study, and actually we have some data from right here in Ontario that was based on a study done by Sharma, who surveyed 378 psychotherapists in Ontario and found that 1/3 had never received any training in racial trauma. The majority were not satisfied with the training that they did receive, and 92% said they needed more training. So this is a problem, and this is a gap that really needs to be filled. And so one of the most important things about creating safety in any kind of attempt to treat racial trauma is going to actually be the quality of the therapists, right? Because if the therapist doesn't have an anti-racist orientation, they can have the best treatment manual in the world. It's not going to go well. And so the first things that we needed to define were what is the essential knowledge? What do the therapists need to come in with to be able to do this work? And these were some of the things we identified: a good understanding of racism, an understanding of the symptoms, racial identity development and how this might impact the therapeutic alliance, a working understanding of individualistic versus collectivistic cultural worldviews, a willingness to discuss racism, and a comfort, and even a willingness to talk about these issues when it evokes discomfort, right? And we know that a lot of therapists, sadly, avoid conversations about race because it makes them uncomfortable, which I always find very interesting and not okay, by the way, given that as therapists, we're trained to talk about all kinds of things like people's sexual behaviors and suicidality and hallucinations and all sorts of things, but we can't ask them about racism. This is just bizarre. So anyway, you got to be able to do that. An ability to learn about their culture, if it's different from yours, from the client, but from other sources as well, right? You can't just burden them to be the only teacher. And then also be able to repair non-defensively any microaggressions or cultural insensitivities committed in session. So, if you're very defensive type, that's not gonna work. And then again, the anti-racist orientation, which means having done your own personal anti-racism and allyship work, which continues on an ongoing basis. And it's not a one and done thing. It's not, I took a lunchtime seminar and I'm good. This is ongoing work. Because you have to understand your own biases, your own blind spots, your own areas for growth, and also how that can affect the therapeutic relationship. And then finally, of course, cultural humility. And so we actually wrote a paper about how to be an anti-racist clinician and this was sort of the foundation of the treatment that we developed, which I should say I'm very proud of this paper because the year it came out, it was the top download for that journal. And that's the reference if you want it. Also, I want to give a shout out to Dr. Sanat for also publishing in this area as well in the lab. So there's lots of great resources that you can access around that. Now, so what we came up with was a treatment protocol called the Racial Stress and Trauma Treatment Protocol. And this is a series of guided sessions, each 60 minutes in length, designed to take place over a 12-week period. And so the protocol itself begins with an initial assessment for racial trauma. The assessment's really important because that's how you understand the symptoms and you can chart progress. And we couldn't even do these assessments until many of us actually developed the tool. So we have them now, yay. And they seem to work well. And then the next part we call stabilization, or stabilization and support, healing, and empowerment. And I'm going to go over these in a little bit more detail with you. These were developed based on a peer-reviewed paper that we published in 2023 in the journal Cognitive and Behavioral Practice. And each technique has empirical support for its use for racial trauma. And then after we put those together, in order for our team to be able to deliver this treatment in a cohesive and consistent manner, I wrote a treatment manual. And by popular demand, the treatment manual was actually just published. So you can actually buy it on Amazon now. How cool is that? And this makes the treatment more widely available. But as I pointed out, even though the individual techniques have all been empirically supported, there hasn't yet been a study to test the whole protocol. And that's what we're going to be doing now. And so this is the foundation of the treatment. It's cognitive behavioral therapy plus functional analytic psychotherapy, which is like a third wave CBT approach, which I should mention was developed by a person of color. Okay. And so before starting, I mentioned assessment. Here's one of the tools that we use that I'm going to refer to later, which is the racial trauma scale. And the goal of the assessment is to understand the distress the person's having. So here's a bunch of symptoms that they might be having. And then you as a therapist, this is going to be important for you to know where their challenges are. And then also to quantify the distress so you can tell how they're improving over time. And so this first part, again, we call it stabilization. Sometimes we also call it stop the bleeding. The reason we call it stop the bleeding is because most of the time, by the time these folks are coming in for treatment, they're already like in really bad shape because they're not coming in for help until the problems are severe. People don't want to admit they've been victimized by racism, and they feel a lot of shame often about their experiences. And so by the time they get to treatment, they usually need a lot of support, just to feel like they can get on their feet again. And so the first 3 sessions, we call those making sense of racism, coping and self-care, and cultivating a support network. And here are the details of that first part with the goal and the techniques that we're going to use. And I don't have time to go into all the details, but I'll just summarize it as saying, this is going to be about strengthening their ability to, strengthening their coping skills and getting people around them, in addition to you as a therapist, to help them be ready to actually get through the next part of the treatment. And so I'm listing these techniques roughly in the order that they are going to be used, but some of the techniques are going to be used throughout. Like you're going to always be, empathetic and supportive. That's not going to stop at any point. And also I should point out that the protocol has to be used flexibly too, because oftentimes racial traumas have, destabilized the person's life, and it can just be hard to get in for sessions. So therapists, we encourage them to be as flexible as possible. The next stage is called healing. And this is where we work on things like dismantling internalized racism, and doing some cognitive work around maybe some of the unhelpful thinking patterns that they've adopted as a result of the racism they experience. We start doing some exposure and processing of experiences of racism to help them get, mastery over those painful memories. And then we start to teach some skills around combating racism in real life, not using them yet, but maybe doing some role play and things like that, having them track and document microaggressions they may be experiencing and processing those in session. And this is, again, the outline of what we're going to be doing for the second phase, which again involves cognitive restructuring, exposure exercises, and skill building. And a big part of that, as I point out, is processing the experiences of racism. And so this means review of the experience, identifying what negative cognitions about the self that were caused or reinforced by the experience. And then as a therapist, you can present a counter narrative this shows the opposite of what the client has come to believe about themselves. And so this is one way, you might work with them to process their experiences. And this allows them to understand their traumatic experience from a more functional vantage point. And then also we teach them how to manage everyday racism and microaggressions. And this is really important too, because oftentimes when people have racial trauma, they've experienced so much racism, so many microaggressions, they're often at this point that just people are rolling over them. And that's got to stop, right? Because they've got to learn how to reassert themselves and not tolerate bad treatment when they're in a position to fight back against it, which isn't always true, but it's often true. And so part of the treatment is learning how to address microaggressions and everyday racism in different situations. And then finally, the last part is called empowerment. And this is where the person really starts implementing, combating racism in everyday life. You start to see post-traumatic growth. They're making meaning out of what's happened to them. Social action, activism, and healing outside of therapy becomes a part of what they do as they change their environment. And then goodbyes, moving on as the person, no longer has the symptoms and feels like they can deal with the challenges of life again. And so again, these are the protocol for that last section. The end also includes relapse prevention. So, I only have a few minutes left. I'm almost done now. It's our pilot study. So we have, so this shows, as of, I guess, about 2 months ago, we had 6 completers, 2 dropouts, and these are their racial trauma scores. And you can see the scores going down. So for the whole intent to treat sample, including the 2 dropouts with the scores carried forward, we actually already have significant findings, with a fairly large effect size, D equals 1.1. And this is basically the treatment goes from week 0 to week 12, and then week 20 is follow-up. And you can see that the participants are continuing to improve even after the treatment is over, which is exciting. Also, if you want to look at the data in a different way, looking at the change scores in terms of the racial trauma scale, actually people's scores, they might tend to, they could dip one way before going the other way. So for many people in the study, kind of confronting their racial trauma, they felt a little bit worse for a while, but then they started to feel better. And you can see also in this chart on the right, the mean scores going down, for everyone as a group. This is actually with one more, this is actually just completers here in these 2 charts. So final thoughts. Racism is a widespread and evolving problem, and its elimination should be our ultimate goal, but this is going to take time. And so in the meantime, while we're actually trying to get rid of racism, we have to have a way to help people who are traumatized by racism, and that is the point of this treatment protocol, which fills an important gap in treating people of color with racial trauma. So so that's all I have. So thank you. And there's some resources. So there's the book and some other things. And
That's time for. Can you go back to the books?
Oh, this one? Yeah. Okay. So the first 3 books I wrote, and then the last one, I wrote the foreword, but it's a good book. I wouldn't have written the foreword.
Any questions? Go ahead.
So I'm thinking about a case of a client that I'm working with, and she faces racism in the workplace, and she doesn't have much connection to her family. Because they've also internalized a lot of the racism. Her work is safe, family's not safe, school isn't safe now that she's back. So I think it's kind of like, how do you work with people where their entire environment is not safe and it just perpetuates the trauma of racism?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And and this is why the first part of the treatment protocol is about building support. So, we'll have people think about who in your life is supportive. Who can you talk to and they're going to get it, right? Not the people who are going to say it's your fault. So, if you've unsupportive parents, they're not on the list. But anybody who would get it. And if the person has no friends at all, then that's you. Then you're going to have to back up and say, where can we help you connect with other people, like, affinity groups or activities where they're going to find like-minded people that they can connect with. And that might take some time, but everybody needs connection. So that's a worthwhile therapeutic goal in and of itself. And then, it's important to also look at the workplace and the environment. In some cases, people are going to need to change the way they interact with their environment to get what they need. In other cases, they're going to need to find a new environment because some places are just so toxic, it doesn't make sense to stay there. So if you are in a position where you can get another job because this job is completely toxic, then that may be the next course of action. And we call that developing an escape plan. Because sometimes that's needed. And I find that people, even in sometimes very toxic environments with many other opportunities, won't leave because they don't want to feel like the haters won. And so this is also an important piece that needs to be processed sometimes.
One more question? Go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. It was extremely interesting. I have a question that might be a little technical, but I hope you have an answer. How do you address the fact that experiencing racism is also about people reacting when you want to address racism? And that reaction can be, like, the dysregulation can be like even more intense if that person also has unhealed trauma they haven't addressed. So for example, you want to try to tell someone, yeah, this is what you just did was racist, and that person cannot experience shame. And
right.
In that time, like, how do you teach that? Or, for example, if you want to have a boundaries with someone's behavior and you try to have that boundaries, but that person also doesn't know how to have boundaries in their own lives, and they see you as inferior because you're Black. So the reaction is even more extreme because of that. So how do you teach or address the fact that we need to be equipped?
Yes. Yes. And as part of this protocol, anytime someone experiences racism, we want them to do something. And sometimes, even if it's something small, and the idea isn't necessarily like, oh, I'm going to teach that person, because they may or may not learn. The idea is to be true, for the person to be true to themselves and to feel like they have agency. So, and even in a case where it's dangerous, let's say a policeman harasses you and you can't do anything in the moment, they have a gun, but you know what? After they're gone, you can call and complain to the police department and say, hey, this guy came, this was not okay. So the idea is to always do something so that you feel like, basically you're not being run over again and again. And this is going to lead the person to feeling more healthy than just having to suffer because of the unpredictable reaction of the person who couldn't hear the fact that they did something racist. And so this can be challenging, but, again, we're taking it from a CBT perspective where a lot of these things may be difficult at first, but you practice them and they get easier. And you can come to inspect it and you can have somebody else having, a meltdown and, you can be fine. Because you recognize that, they have stuff to work on. You've worked through your stuff and you can let their reaction be their reaction. So, yeah. All right.
Thank you. Thank you very much.